Hello and welcome to the second edition of the Smart to Noise Ratio Pro Audio Podcast. I'm your host, Jon Dayton, and our special guest tonight is Brian Moore from Redbooth Studios. We'll be getting him shortly. Just to give you a rundown, since we're kind of new in the game, Smart to Noise started out as just a way for me to sketch out a bunch of ideas for the operators at the church where I'm the chief audio engineer, for them to just learn some stuff because we're not able to get as much face time as I'd really like with them. And lo and behold, pretty soon my friends were reading it, and guys from other churches were using it to train up their crews. And now here we are 2 months later, and we have a worldwide audience. So that's pretty cool. The purpose of the podcast is, for one, to just give people some exposure. The number one question I'm asked is, how do I get into the business? How did you get into the business? So I'm just working on contacting as many of starting with my friends and hopefully branching out from there, but just talking to people and getting their stories about what they do now, how they got into the business, and if we happen to stop off along the way and flap our gums about equipment or techniques or anything else, then it's all good. So on the line with us tonight, and he is coming in by Skype, and I'm a little bit jealous because I'm on a fairly expensive condenser microphone, and his iPhone sounds better, at least in my headphones. But we have Brian Moore, who is the proprietor, chief audio engineer, also assistant audio engineer, coffee boy, producer, editor, mastering engineer, sometimes a sideman musician, and arranger. I think about the only thing he doesn't do is drive the bus and do windows. And I'll let Brian get into a little bit more depth with just who he is and where he is and what he does and how he's set up. But I'll be honest with you, I'm going to pump him up a little bit here. He's one of my favorite guys. He is also a visual artist, just a mind-numbingly good musician and arranger of music. He makes stuff that not anything that would ever be in my palette of taste, but I play his stuff, and it just makes my head explode, and my kids love it, and it's crazy good music. Also a visual artist. He does paintings that I would love to hang on my wall if I had hundreds of dollars to throw at him. And he is also an insane, clinically insane collector of Star Wars artifacts, figurines, memorabilia, and other ephemera. So I think I've laid out a pretty good intro for you. Brian, if my internet connection hasn't failed me, I'm going to turn it over to you and just introduce yourself, and then if you would, grace us with a little description of what you're doing over at Redbooth.
Great, thanks, man. Thanks for having me on your show. I'm actually calling from Myrtle Beach on vacation, so it's nice to be relaxing and kind of reminisce on how I got to this point as far as the business and the studio. And I actually got into doing recording because of being in a band and playing music, and originally just wanted to write and perform live and tour and get in the studio and make music that way. And I actually blew out my voice pretty good and still wanted to keep making music, and I'd been really interested in the recording process, so it was kind of a natural progression into getting into recording. And I did some internships, and then ended up working as a freelance engineer with a couple studios. And then the owner of the most recent studio I had been at was like, "Yeah, I'm moving to Virginia, so if you want to keep working here, you have to buy the studio." So I secured a bank loan and took a bit of a risk, but bought my own business in November of 2006, and that was located in Medina, New York, not far from Rochester, where I grew up. So that's kind of the start of it, and then at that point I was putting together a business plan and trying to figure out how to actually make a living at doing recording and production. And it was nice to be able to do what I loved, but it's definitely been a process to learn how to actually make money at it and how to grow. Because not only are you growing a business, you're trying to grow your skill sets and learn how to do things well and grow in areas of mixing or tracking. Or I started in recent years to delve into doing some live mixing at churches at the Father's House recently, and before that at Mosaic Church. So I've been learning a lot and trying to go between the studio realm and then the live realm as well.
Cool. I'm sorry about that cough there. I didn't realize that was going to make its way to Virginia Beach and back through your iPhone. I'll have to make sure I get way off mic there.
All right.
We're just kind of figuring this out here. I only just recently realized that I'd be able to try and interview people in Roundtable via Skype, so it's a learning process. I'll make sure I post it on the blog for everybody to stop in and listen to just exactly how green I am right here. Well, there's so much stuff I want to ask Brian. More and more in this industry, I mean, it used to be live sound and recording was just two completely separate areas of the biz, and even still, I mean, it's really a different kind of head that you need on your shoulders to sit in a studio and do justice to music, and it takes time to do all the takes and plan out where you're going to go with it finally. And I went into live music because I don't have a lot of patience, and you mix it once and off it goes into the night and floats away over the hills and it's gone. The more I get into it, the more I realize that I need to cram in as much preparation as I can for every event. Since I started being a sound guy at a church, all of a sudden now instead of meeting a band and an hour later having them on stage for a 4-minute sound check and then turning them loose and trying to do justice to their art, now I get a 2-hour rehearsal and then another rehearsal right before the service, and we really have some time to put things together. Well, anyway, so all that to say, the two worlds are starting to intersect because more and more I'm taking tracks from live performances and sometimes quite a lot of tracks from live performances. And so my world is slowly becoming more and more like the studio world. So I'm starting to learn some of those techniques and press them into service. But anyway, the question I really wanted to ask you is, what kind of prep work do you put into a session? I mean, starting from maybe even your first meeting with a client. If you could just give us a quick walkthrough about how you go about your business.
Sure. I think there's the producer kind of way of approaching it, which the first thing we always look at is the song and the material that's going to be recorded before we set up any mics or do any kind of recording. We want to make sure that the band's prepared to play, that the song is as good as it can be, and that we have the right songs picked out. This is pretty standard for most producers to kind of start there, because if the song's not ready, it doesn't make a lot of sense to invest time and money and energy into trying to create something. It can only be as good as the song itself is. So we put a lot of emphasis on writing and making sure there's enough material to choose from before we record. And then once we have the song picked out and we've worked on the instrumentation and the arrangements and we kind of focus on the performances and making sure all the players are prepared, and we're deciding if we want to track it live, if we want to overdub, if we want to do any session musicians on the recordings. And then once we know we're prepared for the actual session, oftentimes I'll end up recording the track live with artists to kind of figure out how it sounds with them just playing it together. And we'll still set up several mics and multi-track it with different channels, but we'll track it without a metronome so that we can just hear what they sound like live, and then make sure that we always refer back to that and see what we like about it and what we don't like about it and what we can improve in the final recording.
So you actually do some demo work, like some outright recording demo work as part of the starting the process.
Yeah, definitely. I think the perspective it provides is invaluable. Like, many of the artists are like, wow, I didn't realize this part felt so long, or man, we should really get some different lyrics here or different vocals here. And it just gets everybody on the same page where we can all listen to what it could sound like and, well, what can we do to fix it? Because usually if you don't do that, once you do the final recording, you're like, well, that's just how we wrote the song. And it's like, wow, it could have been better if we had have the drummer use a ride cymbal here instead of an open hi-hat or something. Like little details where the magic lies, that if a band is not experienced in that kind of scrutiny on their own material, it's really helpful to have that pre-production meeting. So that's usually steps 1 and 2, and then once we actually feel like we're ready to record, preparing for a session, I'm usually taking care of some of the technical stuff, trying to get as much as far as microphones set up and getting my patch bay in order and creating a session file and getting the tempo mapped out if there's any tempo changes, and kind of getting an idea what mic pre's I want to use, what mics I want to use, and making sure I have all the headphones ready to go and patched for the artist so that they're comfortable and they can hear their instruments, and so that they'll be able to perform their best before they get there.
Nice. And something I wrote a post on a blog a little while ago about how, half the time I'm a technician and the other half I'm trying to be creative, or at least in sync with the creative, process that the artists are going through. And I wrote about how all the tech stuff that I do, I try to help that inform me as to what I'm going to do when it's time to sit down and make art. And with your studio being basically a one-man operation, like, are you kind of thinking along those same lines, like when you're out there in the live room miking up, or just going through all the technical part of setting up the session? Like, is that kind of a chance for you to sort of have the creative juices stewing around in the background?
Yeah, definitely. I think even something as simple as selecting which amp to use, it always goes back to the art and the music and the heart of it and the song, because if I'm imagining what this song could sound like, I'm trying to pick out microphones and drums. Are we going to use coated heads? Are we going to use clear heads? But it's even those little technical choices, those decisions are all relating to the art of it. Like music that we've been influenced by and previous techniques that have been used for years, or if we want to try something really different, if we get inspired by a concept or an idea that hasn't been done, then we get creative with what we can do with different miking techniques. And we ended up using an MS pattern on an acoustic guitar and positioning the guitars to one side of the mics, so that when we panned them and then reversed the panning on them, we were creating a stereo image of these two acoustic guitars without actually panning just one mic. We were using the MS pattern to create this natural panning. So like little things like that we're trying to dream up ideas. Like, well, what if we did hand claps out in the big factory and we tried to capture like some real sounds out there? And so you're doing technical things and you're thinking about like the science of recording and the gear and the mics, but then you're also really inspired as an artist. I mean, that's how I got into it, and that's definitely how I work. I geek out a bit on some of the technical stuff, but I'm definitely more on the music creative side of it. And I learn the technical stuff so that I can be better as an artist in the music. But I mean, that's I'll try to decide like what room mics I want on drums. Does this project need really tight up close miking on everything, or is the band going to be into doing more room miking? And that goes with different genres. And sometimes I'm DIing instruments a lot. Sometimes I'm not doing any kind of direct inputs on instruments. It really depends on what the song flavor is and what inspires the artist to make music, and how I can facilitate that. I mean, some of it is all virtual instruments and other stuff is all organic instruments. So it really depends on each project.
Nice. And I can see how it's kind of come full circle, like starting out as a musician, and, when you're young, you don't have money to buy stuff, but you have your time to invest. So like you sit down with whatever, crappy drum kit or lousy guitar and amp, and you just woodshed with those, and spend all the time you can figuring out, what can I do with this limited resource? And just, I think the good guys, as they move on through their careers and get into better equipment, are kind of always in that process. So it goes from, I'm a kid and I want to make music, and then, you start thinking about what it is that you're making the music with, and then, by the time you get to where someone like you or I are, you've got all that experience, and so you're, like you say, you're geeking out about the drum heads, or, are these cables going to work, or do I need to invest in, some handmade mogamis that'll keep the tone molecules from escaping, and then hopefully you're able to swing it back around and get back to making the art again. One other quick question I had for you is, I kind of think of your studio as falling into the, under the realm of being what they would call like a producer studio, where, it's not a huge room, although with Pro Tools, I mean, it can really be about as big as you want. I know a lot of the tracks, or a lot of the projects that you've done that I've looked at, like despite having limited I/O, like you obviously can't take hundreds of tracks at once, but you sort of wind up with hundreds of tracks sometimes if it comes to that.
Sure.
Well, I'm talking a lot. Just what I really wanted to ask you was, are you in general the producer or the co-producer, or are some of the artists coming in with somebody else that they have in mind to produce things, and you act in more just an engineer and a facilitator role?
I'd say 98% of the time I'm doing production with the artists. It's always collaborative. It's always the artist has a vision and I'm trying to support them as a producer, as kind of a outsider's perspective on what they're doing. It's very rare that they'll bring their own producer in. Usually they're coming to me based on stuff they've heard that I've produced and engineered and mixed. I don't love doing mastering myself, but so oftentimes we'll send mastering out, but I'll even end up doing that at times too. So I could think of maybe one or two occasions where I was working with another producer and I tried to kind of take more of the engineering role in those situations.
Nice. My mind totally wandered off like that. I keep going to Redbooth in my mind. I wish I'll have to see. Well, I'll put up a link to it on the podcast, which actually kind of leads me to my next thing. Brian just did a redesign to his website a little bit ago, and I've been sort of a fan. Actually, I pretty much become a fan of everything he works on. I've had the good fortune to be friends with Brian for a while. And he'll call me up like, "Hey, John, I got this track lighting. I really need this track lighting hung up. Can you come up?" I'm like, "Yeah, sure." And, I'll plan usually a whole extra hour. Like if it's going to take me 2 hours and a few minutes to drive there, I'll tell my wife it's going to be 3. Because as soon as I walk through the door, Brian's like, "Hey, baby, come here. You got to get all this stuff." So I get the picture that he's sort of cooped up working on this all the time, and it's kind of rare that he gets to to show off what he does. So he'll come in and play me some of the latest. I don't know what the kids call it, sludge metal or hardcore.
Yeah.
Whatever, but I mean, he plays it and it's just mind-numbingly good. And, he has these kids, 19, 20, 21-year-old kids, and, through the collaborative process in this tiny little studio in tiny upstate New York, there's gold coming out. And, I want to kind of spill the beans a little bit on this, but what Brian's done is he's got this whole page on his website where he's got some kind of sponsored artists, and I'll let him explain it a little better to you, but, what he basically does is, he's scouting around and he finds some talent or some talent finds him. And, his producer genetics kick in. He says, wow, this is really going to be worth something. These guys could really go somewhere. And so I'll kind of partner up with them and maybe, cut them a deal. And then, when it winds up, they sort of wind up promoting each other. Their stuff winds up on his website to sort of help popularize their music. And, they're also kicking it back, kicking business back to him by word of mouth and by advertising on their own websites and Facebook and stuff. And that was just a genius move, I thought. And I'll kick it back over to you, Brian, if you want to kind of walk us through that, like how you got the idea and how you go through all of that process.
Sure. Well, the site, I want to give credit to Brian Wegman. A lot of the ideas, he kind of, well, he's known me for a short period of time, but he really quickly picked up on what I was trying to do as far as how I was branding the business and marketing it. But he designed that whole site himself, and I mean, he really nailed it. He did all of he took some photos I gave him and just ran with it. And originally he was just trying to help me kind of update what I had up there. And then he's like, what, I'm just going to make a new site. And just blew me away with it. I love it. So special thanks to him for putting all that time in and doing that. And he's a really talented audio engineer himself. So he's pretty much my go-to guy as far as any kind of work I can't handle. As far as my workload goes, I'm getting him involved with Redbooth now too, which I'm really excited about. So as far as the whole community concept, for me, I found a lot of talented artists in Rochester and Buffalo, and was kind of like, man, this is the kind of stuff I want to be working on. How do I find these artists and get them involved? And especially when I was first getting started and no one knew who the heck I was, I would just say hey, I'll sponsor your band. I'll give you a deal on recording. And actually I would go to shows and take pictures of bands' live shows and then burn them a CDR on my little laptop that I had at the time and give it to him, be like, here's some photos from your set, great job, like I do recording, I'd love to work with you. And so networking and meeting artists was where it all began. And those relationships, I mean, it's kind of like summer camp where bands will come in, they'll work with me for a bit, and then they come back like, oh, I missed it here. I'm like, kind of feels like leaving summer camp, right? And then they meet other people who have been in summer camp at Redbooth. It doesn't hurt. There's like Star Wars toys everywhere, and it's a really fun environment. So, like bands start to know what other bands are working on. I'll show one client, other clients' work and say, hey, you guys should play with these guys. And so anything we can do to like build an artist community, I think helps everybody. Like everybody benefits from it.
And it's just such a cool range of artists that you picked. A lot of studios years back would get a reputation for kind of being, like, oh, if you got metal, you go to Pyramid, or if you're doing R&B, you go here. And Brian's just really showcased his diversity. I mean, he's got this just pounding metal act, and then there's you got a gospel act and something that's really kind of like essence of indie, and then there's this girl that plays the harp, and it's all mind-numbingly good. So like Brian has just made really good choices about who he partnered up with, and that only helps because the more they're playing around town and the more people are recognizing them, the more they're talking about Redbooth and the process and all that stuff. And like his website, I mean, there's not a ton of stuff on there, but it's almost like my favorite music discovery service because I'll go on Pantera. Yeah, you know where that's going. I'll get on Pandora and type in Pantera because I'm an old school metalhead. But that wouldn't ever lead me to some of this R&B stuff or this teenage girl playing a harp or some of the pop music stuff that he worked on. So it's just a really cool little micro community of stuff that he's done. So, and yeah, pure genius in terms of marketing. I mean, everybody's, they say networking is the key to getting ahead in the business, and there's a million ways to do that. And I think this one's probably head and shoulders above a lot of them. I always suggest to people, print up business cards, get stickers made. Bands love stickers, hand them out. Really sort of putting some skin in the game like Brian's done. And investing in your clients basically is really paid off for him because you're busy now, right? I didn't have this question written down, but you got into the business, and as I recall, you were sort of just about catching traction when the bottom totally dropped out of the economy. And how's it been for you? Like, I know you're pretty busy. Like, have you been just kind of squeaking by, or how's the economy of the business?
It's been good. I mean, I'm still paying overhead and paying off gear loans and all that, but I mean, within a couple of years, I'll be out of debt, so that's really exciting. And I mean, I make enough to get by, and I'm not working any, side jobs or anything. So
he's living the dream, kids.
Yeah, pretty much. Like, I mean, the whole business is changing. So I'm really blessed and grateful to be able to just do what I love and work with great artists. And I know a lot of people that have to do a lot of commercial work, which I really wanted to do music, and I wanted to be able to live off of it. And so I was always like, well, I don't think I'm cut out to do all the post-production work and all that. I really want to work with musicians, and support them in what they're doing and do what I love with creating music. So, yeah, I mean, I'm fortunate to be able to do that. So it's really growing. I mean, I'm finding myself really focused in kind of the indie rock scene and the pop scene, the metal scene, and now it's really starting to take off in the gospel scene, especially with the mixing side of things. I'm working with another local producer in Rochester, Levi Bennett, and he and I started working together for one of his bands, Tinted Image, and I was producing them, and then he's like, hey, I got this track for you to mix, and I've been working with some gospel artists and some R&B artists, and this band Divine Nature I did some work with, and so the scene's starting to buzz a bit with Levi and I working together. So that relationship just opened up a whole new world of being able to mix for the gospel scene, and I love it. I mean, really, variety is the spice of life. If I can mix a metal project and then do a really delicate indie rock harp project and then do gospel, I mean, it's a lot of fun. And I think one of my favorite compliments I got was from some artists that were like, it doesn't sound the same. Like, you're you're making the metal records sound like metal records, and you're making the gospel records sound like gospel records, and it's, nothing's getting smeared together, and the lines aren't getting blurred, which to me just is exciting because it means I'm tuning into what the artist wants, and I'm finding a way to produce each project appropriately. So that was a thrill to be able to do that.
Yep, and I think you kind of found your way into the heart of what it's really about. I mean, everybody that gets into this industry kind of at some point or another, well, first of all, they've had the realization that they're not going to be, whatever rock star they idolized when they were growing up, that like, all right, that's not ever going to happen. But there's this whole world of behind the scenes stuff that I can get into. And then, like for me, I mean, I think I was a little slow on the uptake. I may have been in college before I realized that I wasn't going to get to go to work for Metallica after I graduated. And that was when I started to really open up to other kinds of music. Like, fortunately, I was on a college campus that had a really strong music department, and I had a sound system. And the cool thing was, like, everybody in the music department, it was like an unwritten law that you had to be in at least 3 bands. Because, if you needed a bass player for your metal band, that meant that you had to play guitar in his mariachi band, and then your drummer needed you both to play in his noise rock band. And so, the upshot for me was I didn't play anything, but I mixed I don't know, like 400 gigs in the space of 4 semesters.
Wow.
And that was when I really started to enjoy things. It was like, all right, not everything is up my alley, but, I always tell people, like, I love everything. Like, I love people getting creative on stuff. Like, even if you're not necessarily very good at it, like, I'm just so respectful of people who are putting it out there and trying to create some art. And that's really brought the joy of working it at home. Like, I've had mixed some nights where, Korean language death metal wasn't really what I wanted to do for 2 hours on a given night, but, finding a way to get to that place where, like, all right, I can seek out some little, portion of it that's a gem and get behind that and out of that then make them better because I'm getting into it. I mean, I'm not just like, how many minutes left in their set? I want to go have a cigarette. It's like, oh, hey, what's the bass player doing? Like, turn that up a little bit or, get a little creative with things.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the best producers do that. They find the things that connect with the human spirit, and they bring that to the forefront. And then the things that are distracting, they kind of push back. But it's definitely the team effort of trying to bring out something special.
Well, moving on a little bit, you can't really talk about the studio without talking about the gear. I mean, I always stress that the most important piece of gear is your ears and what's between them. But you're working what they call in the box at Redbooth. So, you have Pro Tools, and Pro Tools is essentially your console. And so I want to kind of pump you here, just get you talking about the way that you use it, like if there's anything you're doing that's sort of non-traditional, plugins, analog outboard gear, new stuff, vintage stuff, just sort of whatever comes to mind. Maybe just start talking about your setup and maybe the things that you use the most, and we'll just see where that takes us.
Sure. Well, for me, I tried to prioritize getting the best mic preamps I could get and the best microphones. I mean, I was really specific about those 2 things just because I knew I was going to be working in Pro Tools, and once I went through the converters, I was like, well, I'm not going to have a lot of analog influence on it. So I can come out of Pro Tools again and run through Outboard, but just as far as like my workflow, I don't end up doing that too often unless I'm not the one that tracks something. So I got a pair of 9098 Neve AMEC channel strips with EQ, and I'm oftentimes using those on everything from kick drums to guitars, vocals. And then I picked out a Avalon 737 SP tube pre, and that has EQ and an opto compressor on it, and some other Vintech 473s and some APIs. And then as far as outboard compression, I picked up a pair of Empirical Labs, the distressors, and I love using those when I'm tracking for things like room mics or sometimes bass guitar. Usually we're running through one of those for vocals a little bit. So
you'll actually commit to a little compression on the way in if it's something you're kind of sure of?
Yeah, I mean, I'm usually doing like a 2-to-1 ratio and just touching it a little bit to kind of get kind of that sound on there. I don't want to do too much to it that I'm not really happy with, because then I'm limited later. But if it's something that I know I'm going to mix, then I don't mind putting a little bit of compression on there when I'm tracking it.
Nice. And so it's a blend of some of the old and some of the new on the mic pre's and the input. But once it's in the box, you tend to really stay in there, huh?
Yeah, for the most part, and unless there's something that I just feel inspired to hook up some outboard, because I'm working on several projects at once. So, I'm opening up sessions, and if I'm doing a lot of stuff in outboard, it just slows down my workflow. But I have a pair of Atom monitors and some Dynaudios, and I'm using a mouse. I would like to, ideally it'd be great to have like a matrix or some sort of like
a dedicated control surface?
Yeah, like a control surface, and it'd be great if it had some like analog summing in it or something like that. But I really, one thing that I've enjoyed about mixing live at church is that I've been able to get my hands on faders again and buttons and knobs, and it's just like inspiring. And I definitely wanted to make sure I was putting money into things that I felt really affected the sound of things, but I also see value in being inspired by putting my hands on some real faders and mixing on the fly. And so it'd be nice to get some sort of control surface to get my hands off the mouse and just, anything to separate me from the visuals on the screen and get me listening and creating in that sort of element, I think would be helpful to the end result too. So
yeah, I hear you on the real estate there. That's one of the big arguments that people who are sort of getting into it but don't really necessarily know. They're like, what console can I get? I don't want to mix in the box, and I think you kind of need to. But yeah, you're right. Like I was mixing down a little something. We took 24 tracks from a Christmas concert here at church, and I think it wound up by the time I doubled some things up and added some plugins, I was mixing about 30 tracks. And I'm pretty fast in this DAW that I use, and so I'm mixing away on the mouse, and then I caught myself. It was like there were guitar solos that kind of spooled up as the vocalist was finishing a line, and I caught myself mixing, like setting up automation based on where that solo started, but realized that, wait a minute, if I had my finger on a fader, I'd be waiting for, singer X to finish that line before I pushed, guitarist Y all the way up into that solo. And so, I suppose it's not a big deal as long as you're thinking like that, but there's, it really is kind of two different schools of thought. Like if you have your fingers on the faders, maybe you're sort of limited. You can only really get about 8 fingers on the faders unless you got groups or VCAs or something. So you really have to pick and choose what you're going to touch, and that can change your mixing style. Or, whereas if you're in the box, the sky's the limit. As many passes as you want to take, and, either, automate stuff with the mouse wheel, which I've done in the past, or if you're going to be drawing stuff in. So that's just two completely different schools of thought to think about. You mentioned summing. I've heard a lot of guys talk about it, and I've finally started working on stuff that's big enough, that's enough tracks that, I've hit the limits a little bit of my puny DSP. I'm not going to tell you what system I use because people will laugh at me. But do you run into issues where, if you're summing, what's a typical channel count on a good-sized project for you?
Around 100, but that's if I'm doing and this is actually changing. Like lately, I've been doing less mics, but I've always been into giving myself options, and sometimes being able to do 100 tracks on a session gives me too many options. But I'm learning to kind of realize which mics always end up which channels get muted, which mics I don't end up using on a bass or on a guitar, and just kind of committing to the few that I always end up using in a mix. So it's getting fewer, and I think it helps as far as an anxiety level and just mental well-being. When you're looking at these big sessions, sometimes it can be intimidating to think, oh, I got to make all these decisions. So I'm trying to commit to things a bit more now that I'm not as cautious with trying to cover all my bases. I know what works for the most part in my studio. So, but it's not uncommon for me to have 5 channels for the bass guitar. I might run a DI and then a few different mics, and I've got a lot to choose from. So sometimes that's the reason why the sessions are so big, and other times if it's a gospel project, I've got like all these different layers of vocals, or if it's a pop dance song, I've got tons of vocal layering there. If it's a metal project, we're layering a lot of guitars, and I do probably 15 channels on drums, especially metal projects where I'm miking a bell or a china, or trying to spot mic stuff and get some nice room mics in there, and top and bottom snare, and sometimes I'll have 3 mics on the kick drum, some inside, some out. So I don't run into too many issues as far as the system I'm running. I'm running a HD2 rig, so I've only got 2 gigs of RAM on my computer. Actually, it's a Mac Intel Tower, and it's from '06, and it's still running great. The only time I run into problems is if I'm running several instances of Melodyne and some virtual instruments, and if I try to use any kind of like programmed drums or anything like that, which I usually don't. If I'm doing anything with drums, it might be like maybe samples that I'll blend into the live drums, but I'm usually tracking live drums on these projects, so that doesn't take up too much processing power. So,
and well, the reason I asked was, it was cool that turned into that whole big description there. I remember sitting in your place one time, and I think you were playing me like Sirens and Sailors or something like that. And folks, check these guys out. Like if you want just a guttural metal experience, and to me they're really a blues band. Like I think of their song "Tough Luck," but anyway, I digress. Yeah. So here I am sitting. Brian puts me in the captain's chair because the sweet spot's really kind of small in his room, and hits play. And I hear these first kick drum hits, and kids, there is so much information below 100 hertz, and then up high, it is so I mean, it was like a symphony. I was just hearing all this stuff come exploding out of the kick, and I scroll over in the project, and there was like, I don't know, 5, 6 channels of kick drum. Kick in, kick out, beater side, room mic, mic in the bathroom, this, that, and the other thing, and then 2 flown in sample and replacements, and so like it was this, the kick drum alone was a huge production on that thing. And well, the reason I asked was because I know like some guys do this, and oh crud, I think I just unplugged. No, we're back. So green up in here, folks. No, really, I do this for a living. I'm really a sound guy. I'll show you my card. Like what I've heard of happening, and actually this used to happen to me on some of the cheaper analog desks is. Like on Mackies, the main summing amps would be okay, and you could push a really hot mix through them. But if you tried to solo too many channels, that summing amp in the solo chain would start to back up on you. And I've heard of guys talking about guys that mix big spreads in Pro Tools actually breaking out, assigning all the drums to a stereo group and actually sending that analog out to like an API desk or some other pretty decent analog desk, and then. So doing like sub-summing of bunches of channels in Pro Tools and then resumming, we're doing like a final summing out in the analog world to kind of get it out of that in-the-box sound. But are you finding that, like with the improvements in Pro Tools over the last few years and with the new I.O. stuff that they have, that's not as much of an issue anymore?
I don't notice it as much. I mean, with what I'm doing, I mean, I did get Heat, which was the HD. It was developed by Crane Song. They kind of like simulating what a actual console sounds like, and it does some cool stuff. And I think ideally, I'd love to be going through some analog summing outboard, even if it was like a rack-mounted thing that would do 16 channels or whatever. Anything I could do to kind of change it, like you said, get it out of the box would be cool.
Because there did definitely used to be. I mean, I think it's kind of, now that I think about stuff that I've heard you do, you don't hear that like, oh, it was done in the box. Like that was just in the box from start to finish. Like it's definitely super clean, but doesn't have like that sterile, squashy, masky kind of sound. So that's cool that you haven't fallen into that pitfall.
Yeah, I think a lot of that has to do with the converters are good, but also just the mic and mic pre's and also trying to do as much of it with real instruments and not get too caught up in the overusing of Superior Drummer or whatever people are using for drums, and trying to do stuff if it's possible, using real amps and microphones. I mean, I just love that, and there's so much you can do to get different sounds. I don't want to pull up a preset on a virtual instrument and try to get a DI'd guitar amp to sound like a real amp when I have it sitting right there. I'd rather do the work of hooking it up and playing through it and experimenting with it.
And that's the big key, is experimenting. Like I love virtual instruments, and in fact, the modeling lately is getting really good. Like I suppose if I was tracking something and I really wanted to try something different. You can throw a virtual amp in a virtual room and move virtual microphones around on it. But like you say, if you actually have a live room and a lot of stuff in it, it's just cool that you've still got your head in a place where you are going to get out there and spend some time laying on the rug and putting different mics in there, because that can really pay off. Like I remember your predecessor, our friend Kevin, who I hope to interview here shortly, when he was running Viking Studios in your old space, there was definitely a Viking drum room sound, and I think it had to do with he had his close miking techniques and whatever, but there was this one ribbon mic, and there was an X on the floor, and the kit had to go here, and it had to be turned a little bit, facing this, but not facing that too much, and then the ribbon mic had to go just here at this height, and I think there was even it had this weird spatial relationship with this ugly old green recliner. Like the mic had to be just so, and the chair had to be just so too. But then, love it or hate it, there was definitely a unique sound that he got, and it was, and how would you figure that out? I mean, you couldn't model that. I don't know, maybe they will. Maybe there'll be furniture modeling thrown in with the next set of
like the Viking ribbon mic technique.
So Kevin's busted old Salvation Army purchased chair. But I don't know, I just think that's so cool that you're kind of living the dream that's sort of gone away. I mean, it used to be that, if a record company was going to pick up a band, throw all kinds of money at them, sure, go ahead, rent a chateau in France, come back in a few months, bring us the record, and we'll shovel some more money at you. And, the whole time I was growing up, I mean, I would watch bands, play locally for months or sometimes years to save up enough money to go, and all the studio time they could afford was in the middle of the night and on used tape and with no producer and maybe not even with an engineer. And that whole experimenting thing was lost. It was just at the time it was the pop metal era. So it was like, all right, guys, we're going to get in. We got 12 hours. We got to do everything we can to make it sound as much like Cinderella as possible or Motley Crue or whatever and get out of here. And, they just totally missed out on being able to come up with something new and unique. And, I don't know if anyone missed out on the chance to be the next big thing because of that. But that's one of those things that's just so cool about the type of setup that you have, that you've got the time to invest and you've got the drive to do it. Like, you're not just going to say, I'm sure you've got some tricks, some go-to stuff that you do that you're like, all right, well, I'm doing this. I've had good results with this in the past. But just the fact that you're willing to go out there and get rug burn on your knees, crawling around an amp, figuring out where that sweet spot is.
Yeah.
And I actually wanted to ask you. I mean, don't reach too deep into the cookie jar and give away all the goodies, but just giving us an example of either one, just a go-to trick that you have that maybe you kind of finally go to out of frustration, or maybe it's a starting point and you move off from there, or even just something that you discovered, like a happy accident that led to being something cool and something you wound up using and would maybe use again. Sure.
Well, my favorite mics to use, we're talking guitar amps, so I really love the 57 and a 421, which a lot of people use. I mean, it just works for me, and sometimes I'll throw a 121 on there as well. But for the most part, that's what I love using. And sometimes I'll experiment with an SM7 or an RE20 or a E609 or 906. But for the most part, I still trust the sounds I get from a 421 and a 57. And don't be afraid to angle your mics. I mean, that is something that always helps me, is to actually even throw a pair of headphones on and mic around and listen to what it does and really get familiar with what those mics can do. And maybe, before you start putting two mics on, start with one and see how many different sounds you can get with that one mic. Until you're aware of what you can do, you don't know, where to start. It's kind of like, get that idea in your head of what you want, maybe reference some of your favorite tones, and start with that. Give yourself a reference point so that you know when you've arrived at what you want. Otherwise, because especially electric guitars, distorted guitars are so abstract in sound, and they can get noisy and take up a lot of room really quick. I always suggest that people reference, but that's stuff that helps me, because I find guitars to be really tough. I love doing drums, and for some reason that comes pretty easy to me in the studio, but
the guitars are tough, because guys sweat and bleed over their tone, and then they turn it over to you, and you got to try and do it justice, but you also kind of want to try and maybe push them in a different direction, and it's like there's a real delicate negotiation there sometimes about what their sound is or what they perceive their sounds to be. If you wind up against one of these guys that bought himself a Stratocaster and a Fender Tweed and thinks he sounds exactly like Stevie Ray Vaughan, then whatever. But another thing I wanted to butt in and say, go ahead.
Well, or he bought that same rig and he's in a metal band, and he wonders why it doesn't sound like that,
And the other thing I wanted to point out is kids listening at home. If you're putting your studio together, all those, it can seem kind of like fantasy land to think, Neve preamps and API. Look on eBay. It's not cheap stuff, but half the mics that he just described are, one, not fancy studio condenser microphones, and two, available for some of them a good deal less than $200. And his stuff sounds great. I can vouch for it. Go to the website and check it out. There's some pricey stuff that he's dragging out there, but you're running into some of the same stuff I did. I've talked about this before. It's kind of like my shining glory is I recorded a drum kit with like a D112 in the mouth of the kick and a 57 overhead, and the rest of it was just bleed on the guitar amps. We did some live tracks, just to have, just for scratch. Yeah. But it came out sounding so cool. Like you felt like you were in the room with the band, and it wasn't, any highfalutin stereo, AB or MS or any of these other highfalutin stereo or surround setups that you can get into. It was just like, all right, well, I'm a live sound guy and I have this recorder, so here's my live sound gear and here's all my $100 dynamic mics. And I was actually being lazy. Like, I didn't have the tracks or the time to set up a full drum miking, so I was like, all right, kick, overhead, done, next. And that's one of my favorite happy accidents. I reference that all the time. Is there anything like that you ever done where, like, either you were in a hurry or something broke and you had to go to something that you wouldn't normally have used, like anything that you just kind of discovered totally by accident that wound up being awesome?
The first thing that comes to mind is just when bands play live without a metronome. Sometimes there's just some amazing stuff that happens when you're not trying to control and when the artists are just playing and not overthinking. So there's value in that sort of scenario too, if you can record live. We've done things with, I'm trying to think of some specifics.
Well, how about just like an oddball miking technique? Have you ever just, like thrown a 57 on the floor somewhere, or, just something zany like that, or tried something just in desperation after you've been trying all the stuff that makes sense?
Yeah, I'll play around with a lot of room miking, and I'll throw a mic in a side room and I'll experiment with how much I leave the door open, especially on drums when I'm trying to get some interesting sounds for that.
I never would have thought a door position. That's gold right there, man.
Yeah, really, one thing that helps me a lot is listening in the room. I'm usually walking around. There's one mic that I have out in front of the kit usually, and I'll actually walk around the room, and there's this sweet spot where I know when the drum's in one position in the room that the low end kind of converges in this one super punchy spot in the room, like really resonant, lots of low end definition. And I know if I put the mic right there where I hear it with my ears that I'm going to get that sound. So don't be afraid to walk around the room and really listen in the space. You'd be surprised where things converge and really sound awesome. Especially with drums, the size of the kit isn't always, the close mics. Oftentimes it's a combination of close mics with the room mics, which is why it's great to have a big live room like a Redbooth. It's you can get some really sweet sounds.
I love that. I ask him a question about equipment, and he talks about his ears. What does that tell you, kids listening at home?
Yeah.
Don't get too many piercings. It could throw off your perception.
Yeah. Well, I think that's another thing, too, that I definitely want to encourage people is the value of what you're doing and what the choices you're making are always outweigh the gear you have. I mean, I would rather work with a seasoned engineer with some 57s and whatever board we have than to have the best studio in the world and a novice engineer come in the room. It's so much more important to have those skills and the experience. And when you can put the two together, when you have a really amazing engineer and some amazing gear, then you really can get some magic.
Cool, man. Well, I also wanted to ask you, have you ever had just, that moment when your heart just drops like down and right out of your body? Like, have you ever had just a horrendous moment in a session, like drive fail, something blow up, or, just a crazy moment that you had to try and recover from?
Yeah, I had a video card go on my Mac once, and I didn't know what it was. I didn't know if I lost the work we had been doing that day. I mean, I can't stress enough to back up your sessions every day, back them up. If you've got time machine, use it. Like anything you can do to like protect your time investment, you don't want to lose a session, and thank God I haven't yet. I mean, I think once I lost a couple guitar takes, and that's about it, but always back stuff up. One cool story, recently I had a client come in who wanted me to do some work on a live mixing project, and the artists that came in were from out of town, and they couldn't redo the vocals, and the vocal tracks had been recorded with the hi-hat somehow being patched into the same track. I don't know if it was in the board or if it was a digital issue, but the hi-hat was in there, and I'm sitting there going, man, what are we going to do? Like, so I'm like, well, is this hi-hat feed recorded separately? And they're like, yeah, we've got a hi-hat track. So I lined up the phase of the hi-hat original and the vocal mic with a hi-hat, and it inverted, like flipped the polarity so that it was acting as a filter, removing the hi-hat from the vocal track. And then I bust that out to an audio file, and you could literally hear the hi-hat start to disappear as you raise the fader and the balance between the two. And right when I got it where it was negating this hi-hat bleed, you were left with the vocal. And then I just printed a whole new audio track of the vocal.
Beautiful. That's old school. I mean, that's a technique that's been around forever, but not a lot of people know about it. I've just heard some other studio guys talking about it. And coming from the live world, I never would have known or I mean, for me, like phase and polarity interactions just mean a completely different universe of problems that doesn't necessarily intersect with, like you're almost, I would almost never be in a position to have a solution like that work. So that's a cool trick to know about. And actually, since I've found out about it, I've had a chance to use it once or twice myself. The pastor here at our church left his mic on and fired up he commenced to sing, and we didn't necessarily want it to go to print. And
right.
So I wound up using that little trick. I was like, oh, well, he has his own track, and then the band has their other track. So I flipped him over and pushed things back and forth until he disappeared. It was like,
yeah, it's amazing. Like, you don't think to do that stuff until you're forced to do it. But, I mean, phasing is such a powerful tool. And, if people are learning about recording, do some research on it. And because it can be... I mean, it can have some drastic effects on drums, on bass guitar if you're using mics and DIs, and like it's pretty powerful stuff. When I started to hear and do some A-Bing between stuff, I mean, it really opened my eyes to how important that is.
Mm-hmm. And actually, now that live sound has improved so much in the last few years that guys are with these pristine line arrays and digital consoles, and you can actually on a lot of these desks now like go in and time align a direct line from an instrument and put a few microseconds of delay on that so that it lines up with the sound that's coming into the mic.
Right.
And, it's not even that you necessarily want everything totally aligned. Like maybe you don't, but that's just like things are so good now that adjustments like micro delay between a DI and a mic matter. And then you get it's this whole new universe of choices that you get to make about the sound. And like phase is one of my favorite things to play with. Like I discovered it by accident. I was going to A/B some guitar mics, on a 57 and a 609 that I just bought. Threw them both on an amp at a a show, and I was mixing festival style. I had 5 or 6 bands to get on and off stage. So I was just being like, all right, 57, 609. And then I put them both up, and it was like the universe dawned anew. Like, wow, both EQs are straight up, and I've got a fat channel and a skinny channel. But if I reverse them, I get this really blasting solo channel. And if I reverse them again, I get this massive rhythm channel. Yeah. And especially like working at the time, I was working for like mostly high school bands that had junk gear and didn't really know what they were doing. So like, instead of taking one mic and trying to just EQ the daylights out of it and create a guitar tone that made some sense or that was helpful, just the interactions and the comb filtering that you can create. And I don't even necessarily understand it. I mean, I suppose if I had some sort of visualization or something that I could see what was going on, it might make sense. But it also doesn't need to be that technical. I mean, it started out as just something I felt and, was catching with my ears, and now I understand a little bit better those interactions that are going on. But, that's a plug-in can't do that for you, kids. That's old school, playing one thing against another. I mean, that's how, Led Zeppelin got some of those incredible guitar tones on their stuff, and it's just been handed on down through the ages.
Yeah.
Real quick, I just wanted to, since you're involved in the business of making music, hopefully for fame and profit. Have you got any thoughts on just what the state of the industry is right now? I remember a college professor of mine saying back when digital MP3s were first becoming available, and he was saying, mark my words, in a couple of years it'll be $1 a song, and it won't be a big deal, and piracy is going to it'll still be there, but it's not going to be such a big deal. Anybody will be able to just make a record and put it on the internet and get $1 for their song. And it's going to kill the record labels, and and we were like, yeah, right, buddy. And sure enough, it started about a year after that, and we're kind of almost there. So anyway, just to sort of put you in that frame of mind, just have you got any thoughts about just where the state of like the business of music, the royalty side or the pay for play kind of side of it is, and where you think it's going, or any advice to bands or people working in the industry, just anything at all here as we're getting down to the last few minutes here.
Don't make CDs because I think they're just about done. I mean, for bands, if they're putting a lot of money into making CDs that are going to end up sitting in their basements, it's a shame. So I think a lot of bands are doing download cards or vinyl and download cards, or if you're going to do CDs, do a short run of them. I mean, I keep seeing Target get fewer and fewer CDs available to purchase there, which is where I used to get a lot of stuff, and
that's from big national acts.
And that's national acts with a big chain. So I mean, I think if these smaller CD stores like like Record Archive and all them, if they continue doing like vinyl, I think it'd be cool to see that kind of have a resurgence. I don't know if it'll ever really come back to that much of a degree, but I think iTunes is competing with Spotify now, where you can. I mean, I think that's where it's really going is subscriptions to paying a certain amount a month, and you get access to any music you want. I don't think it's going to be as much of like an album with CDs. It seems like things are becoming much more open as far as YouTube and the internet, and bands doing a single and a video and releasing that, and then having a live version of the song on YouTube, and all these different ways to kind of create buzz about their band. But the beautiful thing about it is that the artists are getting a lot more empowered, and if you've got something that really connects with people, it can spread like wildfire, and you don't have any corporation there taking your profits. It can be the artists empowered. So, I mean, in that sense, it's a really exciting time. And for what I do, it's exciting because I get to work with the clients who are actually the musicians. They're the artists. They're the ones that have their own branding, their own business, and they're looking for me to help them with their business, as opposed to being hired by a label to make something the way the label wants, and maybe the people at the label aren't even musicians themselves. So I'm really excited because it just opens up a whole new world of people who are like, hey, I want to I'll do like a drum cover video where I'm recording with all this professional equipment in a professional space, and we're shooting video from a couple angles, and people are competing to get the best quality video for YouTube now. So it's opening up a whole new business avenue for these clients that are coming in that want to do drum covers or vocal covers or they want to post themselves on YouTube, but they want really good video and audio. Live video, like I'll be doing a lot more audio for like a mobile recording setup where we'll go to a show for a video company and do the audio and then mix it back at the studio. So it's pretty exciting to see like all the stuff that people are doing in order to get a following in this new kind of realm where the labels are losing their control on it.
Preach, brother. That's one of my favorite things about it now is that somebody else pointed this out to me. I mean, it wasn't my epiphany, but like it used to be that one thing that was kind of cool that's sort of gone is that a label used to get a hold of a band and they would give them, if they saw some promise, a deal for like 3 records, 4 records, 5 records, and then they would be the baby band on the label and they would use the big selling acts to invest in this new talent and get them with, people to help with songwriting, co-write, or, just coach them, and producers to help them make the most of what they could do and just keep putting records out until they hit. But then, once the payoff came, they were only seeing literally, fractions of pennies on the dollar. And I just think it's so cool now that even though that's kind of gone away, the days of, the limo rides and, rent a chateau in France and make a record, you got to do it yourself. But
yeah.
Now success isn't, coast to coast fame and having a platinum record, but that you only make 1.5 cents off of each one of those copies. Now if you could be really a pretty big star and turn a lot of heads on a national and even a global level, if you just manage to sell, a single to one of all of your 10,000 Facebook followers. And the beautiful thing is, like if you sell 10,000 units for a record label, honestly, you're probably going to get dumped, or relegated to the back burner. But if you sell, 10,000 downloads on iTunes, I don't know exactly what the return is to the band, but you just made enough money to get back in the studio right there.
Yeah. Yeah, it's really cool. I mean, and nobody, is being held back because of lack of distribution. I mean, anybody has the opportunity to put something up on YouTube and have it spread naturally. And that means that, like, yeah, people can get popular if they suck and it's funny, but people who have real talent, I mean, just amazing artists who never would have been heard necessarily in the old way that things were done, could overnight really blow up. So, I mean, it's I feel like it's kind of helping to weed out a lot of these bands that were manufactured by corporations to make money, and it's putting the heart back into what people are doing and the music, and it's giving people an opportunity who I think deserve to be heard, the opportunity to do that without, competing with bands that, in my mind, like, need a lot more work and to practice more. But, because they have a corporation behind them with lots of money pushing them and saying, this is what's cool, buy this. It's like, wait a second, like, what happened to the art behind it? So to me, it's really exciting. It's empowering.
And another cool thing is, one of the things that I was kind of sad to see going away was like, all right, well, if big music goes away, what's going to happen to big tours? Because, there is something to be said for, seeing the Foo Fighters in an arena. I mean, that's, they wouldn't be the same in a 1,000-cap club. Not that it wouldn't be cool, but it wouldn't be that huge rock experience. But then I got to thinking, somebody told me the statistic the other day that every weekend of the year in Britain, in the summer season, like from the time it gets warm until winter starts again, there are 2 major festivals every weekend. And things are really starting to explode in the States. I mean, there's these little small regional festivals, county fairs, like there's all these festival stages. And, even where we live here in Western New York, I mean, you can find a lot of stuff going on, a lot of small stages to get on and play. And you might not make much for the gig, but if you can get there and, sell a few downloads, sell a few CDs, get some names on your mailing list, you're not paying a production company to,
right.
you could play a lot bigger stage at a festival than you could ever hire, a production company to set up for you. So like the touring isn't going to be, Ozzy and the boys piling on the bus and going from stadium to stadium. It's going to be, you and your mates in a smelly van, probably with a trailer, which isn't as glamorous, but you can go play good-sized stages in front of good-sized audiences at festivals all summer long. And, heading down south, the season's even extended a little bit. All right, we're running a little long here. I'm limited on how much time I can upload here with my current provider, but I wanted to ask you one last thing before we go. How much does the fact that so much music is listened to on Bud earphones, on an iPod or another, a phone or another portable device, how much does that figure into the way that you mix?
It doesn't really change much for me because I just approach it as trying to make it sound good in the studio, and then hopefully it translates to the earbuds. I mean, I honestly don't check that much on earbuds. I'll check in my car a whole lot. Even though people are going to listen on the earbuds, I mean, I'll be conscious of where some of the frequencies are at that, are going to be rolled off or aren't going to really translate to those earbuds, and make sure that some of the lower mids are going to be there for the bass guitar and things like that. But, I mean, for the most part, it's still the same process. Get inspired, and when you feel tingly and it feels right and it's sitting where you want it and it feels powerful, then you're good to go. And so hopefully that energy translates.
Nice. All right, well, I'm going to use the latency of the internet here to generate a big round of applause for you. I think I'm hearing some slapback there. Just ladies and gentlemen, I called Brian, about 4 o'clock this afternoon, asking him if he'd be willing to do an hour-long interview with me, and he was like, yeah, sure, what the heck. So I took care of some stuff that I had to take care of, and we hooked up on Skype, and I thought things wound up pretty cool. I learned some stuff tonight. Hopefully our listeners did too. And Brian, I'll be looking forward to invite you back. I'm hunting around for other students.